Welcome, everyone, to our discussion today about wellness privilege. I have a wonderful guest with me today, Sacha Thompson. Sacha, it is so nice to see you. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Laura, for having me.
So, Sacha is the founder of the Equity Equation LLC. It's a diversity coaching and consulting firm that's based in the Washington, D.C. area, specifically Maryland area, which is close to where I'm from. And for those of you who are coming in, I see Kelly Faircloth, who was with me at HBCE earlier this month in Florida, is here with us. But if you want to let us know where you're coming from, we'd love to hear that. So Kelly, go ahead and share where you're coming from, and everyone else, as you come in, let us know where you're coming from. So Sacha works as a certified professional diversity coach and also a psychological safety coach, a piece that I think is so important. Just that it's not enough for us to be talking about diversity, but we really, and DEI kinds of issues, we really need to be thinking about how do we create the conditions in which we can begin to have more open conversations. And certainly that begins with having a level of psychological safety. I love this piece, Sacha, about how you work with executives around, while they might have good intentions, how do they actually translate those intentions into action? How do they overcome their fears? How do they overcome their own personal, perhaps unconscious biases, which is so often the case? And then also this piece about how so many organizations now are starting to invest in DEI initiatives, obviously, especially post George Floyd, but how often these may be well-intended, but may create some trauma for the people that they are intended to help. So I'm really interested in learning more about that. And then today we're going to be really zeroing in on some of the work that you've been doing around women in the workplace and kind of women writ large, but then also more specifically women of color and how there's overlap, but also there's some different experiences there. So it looks like we've got some people here coming in. Cynthia coming in from Miami. Welcome. And Jessica, it looks like that she's having connection issues. So AJ, maybe you can help out with that. Jessica coming from Vermont. Oh, and you're good now. Okay, great. And then Pittsburgh, Cecile is coming from, and Faith is coming from New Jersey. So welcome, everyone. So a few things also that I just want to mention from the outset that you should know about Sacha. She offers one-on-one coaching for DEI practitioners. She's launching an online course, which also is accompanied with group coaching that launches next month. And then she has her wonderful DEI After 5 podcast. And I love that name. And so AJ is going to be putting that in the chat here, how you can learn more about these things. So Sacha, could you just share with us a little bit about your story and how you got here?
Yeah, so thank you, first of all, Laura, for having me. It's been interesting. I was having a conversation with someone yesterday about this, and I don't know if I actually consciously said, yes, this is what I want to do. I was a sociology major in college, and so I focused on cultural diversity and ethnicity. So it was always something that was interesting to me. And then every career that I've had after that touched in diversity or equity in some way. So I spent some time in higher education. So I worked in multicultural affairs and student services, working with students, but mostly the students that were students of color or underrepresented in some way always found themselves in my office for some reason or the other. I transitioned into working for the company that actually owns the GMAT test for several years. And a part of my job was getting people to think about, students to think about taking the GMAT early. And so a lot of my work there was working with HBCUs, tribal colleges, and organizations working with Native American students, and working with organizations focused on women in business education. And then did a little bit of a pivot and took a couple of years off to go into tech and did tech marketing for a few years. And so did that, trying to figure out, okay, what does marketing even look like in the tech industry? And ended up going to a small startup where I was the first Black woman that the company had hired.
Wow.
And quickly my DEI hat came back on, to say, okay, there are some things here that we need to work on. And so ended up doing that for a while, worked at the last company for a couple of years. And then in September of 2020, launched my own business. So
Wow.
yeah, it's been
Here you are.
a whirlwind. Yes.
And I can only imagine, well, first of all, in higher ed, what's so fascinating is that there's been a push for so long to diversify higher ed in terms of the student body, and certainly also in terms of those who are teaching there. But it's not enough to get kids into the school. There has to be a lot of added measures around how do we keep them there? What are the things that we as an institution need to be doing so that they continue to feel cared for and welcomed and supported through their 4 years? And of course, that's also true in the workplace as well. It's not enough to diversify. We need to really think about what we need to do. And I'm curious about, especially working in tech, you're working at a company where you were the only Black woman, what that must have been like.
Lonely for a bit. And, it was one of those things where I think, especially women of color, we try to fit in, right? Do what we need to do to fit in. And it came to a point where there were a couple of situations that came up that I was like, okay, I'm just way too uncomfortable with what's happening right now. And one of those was, being at a team dinner. I was one of two women in the room, where one of the guys at my table, made this declaration. This was 2016, that, racism only came back with the last president. And I had to make the decision, okay, do I flip this table and lose my job? Or like how do I even deal with that? Like that comment, because every single person at that table, who all happened to be white men, were looking at me. Right. And so no one was coming to my rescue. No one was saying anything. I had to make the decision to speak up, right? Unapologetically speak up. And so that was the point where I decided, I need to just show up unapologetically in this space. And if I make you uncomfortable, then that's not my problem.
I love that idea of showing up unapologetically, and I'm curious also. I know there's a lot of discussion now around, instead of just calling out, calling in, and how you might call someone like that into a conversation, particularly if nobody else is standing up as an ally on your behalf.
So how I would respond now may or may not be very how I responded then. When it happened, the first thing I did was I left the table. Like I left the room, and went to the bathroom and cried. Because I was just so frustrated, mad, all of the emotions at one time. And I knew that I could not show up that way at the table, because then I would be labeled the angry Black woman. I'd get all of these other tropes, attached to me. And so I ended up pulling myself together and going back to the table and saying, you can't speak about racism unless you have been a part of it. Right. I was like, I grew up in parts of Virginia where I had to hide from the Klan as a child. This isn't ancient history, right? This is in my lifetime. And for me to say that, and this is someone who thought we were cool, right? So for him to hear from someone that he knows that that's been their experience, it was a little jarring for him. But then his boss made the comment, and we've talked about these things. The boss made the comment of, "Oh, don't report him to HR. That's just how he is."
Wow. That's just how he is, and that's okay.
And that's okay.
That's okay.
Right.
Wow. Yeah.
And so my reaction at that point was, don't worry, because I'm reporting him, you, and their boss. Their VP was at the table. I was like, I'm reporting all three of you.
Good for you.
Because this is unacceptable.
Yeah, and that really gets to the piece around these issues are not something of the past. This is very real today, and it continues in subtle ways and in overt ways. But also it's something that we have to think about not only on an individual level, where an individual like yourself is having to stand up for yourself, or even individuals standing up as allies for one another, but that this really needs to be an institutional change as well, a collective effort.
Yeah.
So I'm curious about, so we're at the kind of the nexus right now between Black History Month, coming to the end of Black History Month, and about to move into Women's History Month. So this really ties nicely with this deep dive into looking at issues facing women in the workplace, and how that is both similar and different for women of color. And I know that you've been engaging in a women's work initiative, partnering with Kathleen Zamitis. And so tell us a little bit more about that work, and again, how this is kind of for women as a whole, but also how you speak about it as a unique experience for women of color.
Yeah, so thank you for bringing that up. Kathleen and I partnered together last year to do this women's work initiative. And what it is really making sure that as we're having conversations about women and women's issues, that we're not just creating one singular box and one singular story, right? Women, particularly of those of marginalized communities, have different experiences, and making sure that those stories and those experiences are heard, but not just heard, that they're valued, that they're seen as important as well, right? And not just because, oh, okay, yep, we're going to hear those one or two stories and tokenize them, but that's a part of the fabric of, if you're going to do anything around gender, specifically women, that you're representing all women, right? So I tend to not do a lot of stuff around women's issues with organizations, because I'm like, how are you defining women, right? If I look at your programs, who am I going to see that's represented? Am I seeing someone, a trans woman? Am I seeing a woman with a disability, visible or invisible? Am I seeing women with multiple identities? Because all of those things shape how we show up in the world and how we experience the world. And so that's what Kathleen and I were really talking about, is making sure that if you have something around gender, and specifically women, that it's not just telling a singular story, but that all women feel that they are valued, seen, and heard in that narrative.
It's so fascinating around, there's not one singular story, and that it's different for every woman, along these lines of sexual identity, for example, sexual orientation identity, or other issues around abilities, color, race, all of these different parameters. But also within that, there are a lot of individual experiences. And so I'm curious for our audience, how would you define a woman, coming from yourself? Like, what does that mean to you? And what are stories that you have around really being seen? Because I think that so much of this is about really being seen, and that your experience is being recognized, and understanding how much that differs. So that brings us to this, our theme today around wellness privilege. So wellness privilege is an idea that Karen Catlin and I have been teasing out. Karen Catlin, author of Better Allies. She's also been a guest on this LinkedIn Live show. And we've defined it as that some people are imbued with more privilege, more access to better health and well-being than others. And that we haven't necessarily characterized it as privilege, but privilege does in fact play a role. So for example, if you want to get healthier, happier, get out into nature. Well, while that's a well-intended tip, it is rife with assumptions around having access to that nature. We know that 100 million Americans don't have easy access to green spaces. So how would you define wellness privilege, and particularly in relation to this nexus between women and women of color?
So I've been thinking about this, and what I wrote down was the ability to unapologetically take care of yourself, mind, body, and soul. Right. And
I love that.
Unpacking that to be able to say, you know what, I need to step away because I need to take care of self. And that may look very different for a variety of reasons for different people, but I wanted to add that unapologetic piece, because I think so many people feel guilt or feel a sense of obligation when they do things for themselves. And so being able to do so and feel okay doing that, right? I don't have to tell you why I'm doing it, right? I just know that I need to do it and I'm okay with that.
And I know that's a piece that you've been really digging into in your last DEI at 5 show. Your guest, and you discussed this idea about this, being a DEI practitioner and leader, and for any of us standing up for these issues, how self-care is such an important piece of this, and that defining wellness privilege as unapologetically caring for yourself.
Yeah. And I think that it was a lesson that I learned the hard way, right? So I was in a situation, I was in an organization where it was extremely toxic for me. My hair was falling out. I was having ulcers and other gastrointestinal issues due from stress, all because of stress. And once I removed myself from that situation and realized, you know what, I can define what success looks like for me. I can define what my day looks like for me. I can choose what I want to engage in and not engage in and do so unapologetically. Like everything changed for me. And so for my coaching clients and for anyone that I'm working with, self-care, like that's a part of the process, right? So every single person knows one of the questions I'm going to ask you is, how do you take care of yourself?
Such an important piece. And when you stepped away from the table, that was in that earlier story, that was a manifestation of you caring for yourself.
Yeah.
Before you came back to talk with the table. So I'm curious for our listeners, how you would define wellness privilege, what that looks like for you. So I'm wondering if we can now look at a few of these examples of wellness privilege. And for Kelly, who is at HBCE, this is something that I did where I went through some of these examples. So one being, I have access to mental health resources such as an employee assistance program, also known as an EAP program. So I know you have some thoughts on that, Sacha, but could you walk us through a little bit about the assumptions that go with that statement?
Yeah, I mean, I think most people, and I think we talked about almost 90 something percent of organizations have an EAP program. What became very, very visible um, over the last few years is many of those programs were not very diverse, right? And the offerings that they provided. So when the murder of George Floyd happened, and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, the country as a whole was going through racial trauma, right? But particularly the Black community. And so when EAP organizations were being tasked to, okay, we want therapists to be able to help, very few of them had Black therapists, right? And even now with what's happening in the Asian community, very few of them have Asian therapists or know how to deal with racial trauma. And so we found that there was a huge gap in that offering. So yes, I can check the box to say that my company has an EAP program, but does it provide the services that I need that's very specific to who I am and where I am in this space?
I'm curious for our listeners here, how many of your organizations have EAP programs? If you would mark that down. And just as you were saying, Sacha, over 90% of large companies have an EAP program, but we know that the rates of utilization are somewhere around 6 to 7%. But that disconnect where there is so much trauma and yet we're not really meeting that. I often think about the girl who took the video of George Floyd and how she described how George Floyd could have been her dad, could have been her uncle, could have been her cousin. And that experience for her as a Black teen is completely different. For example, someone like myself, and that's why there really needs to be that connection, those shared experiences.
Yeah. And when you said that, it just reminded me I think it was 2017, there was a similar case that happened in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And literally at that time, my boyfriend's from Louisiana. I had to drive through Baton Rouge. So I was taking him to the airport, he and his twin boys, taking them to the airport, knowing that they would have to drive through Baton Rouge. And I broke down and just could not stop crying. And ended up taking that day off from work. And
Mm.
my boss, who I love and has the greatest of intentions, in her mind, she was just like, I don't understand why you're so emotional. Like, did you know him personally? And I'm like, I don't have to know him personally to be
Right.
impacted by this. To know that I have, 3 Black males that are about to drive through this area that is teeming with police officers, right now. And so the anxiety, the anger, all of that was a part of who I was. And so companies not understanding that, even at that time, that was a problem because I couldn't go to EAP. Who could have helped me?
When it
Um,
would have created perhaps more trauma than from
exactly.
the outset, which is again a piece of your work is really helping organizations to create support that's actually supportive rather than creating more trauma. It looks like we've got quite a few people who are sharing that
Mhm.
their organization does offer EAP. Rachel writes here, yes, we have EAP, but we lack counselors who are available, let alone diverse counselors. And Kelly writes, we do, and we try to weave behavioral health throughout our culture. It's so important. And Faith is writing here that her organization, they also have offerings around this. So again, really kind of connecting the dots, I think, between these different offerings. One I want to move to another wellness privilege here, which is this one I was sharing with you earlier, Sacha, and Kelly is familiar with this. I get equal airtime in conversations and meetings. I feel valued and am rarely interrupted or ignored. So the story around this is that it's just at the beginning of this month, while I'm on stage unpacking this wellness privilege, a gentleman in the audience interrupted me to share that he disagreed with my point. The irony totally lost on him that he was making the case that he needed to interrupt me. So one of the questions that I had asked you, and I would love for you to share now, how would you have responded?
Oh goodness. If I'm on stage or if I'm in the audience, right? I think it's two different, you know, because I actually had a very similar situation happen not too long ago where I was co-facilitating a program and a gentleman interrupted. I let him finish and I was like, okay, let's unpack what just happened. Right. And just really kind of started to break down so he could see like, oh crap. Like I'm a prime example of what you're talking about, right? The other time that it's happened for me, and I think that this is where we've started talking about community being so important, was I've had male colleagues stop the gentleman or whoever it was to say, let her finish her point, right?
And that piece is so important. I mean, incidentally, there was no man who stepped in at that moment in the audience. A powerful woman shared her story, but it was really there was at that moment we needed a man to
Yeah.
say something. Mhm.
And I think that's where I have challenges with the word ally and allyship because it's not self-appointed. It's a verb, right? What are you doing? What are you actually doing to step in and step up, right? And so those are the times when we need it to happen. But what I find is that people are afraid to step up because they don't know what's going to happen to them. And so it's like I'd rather it happen to you and then I tell you behind afterward, sorry, it happened versus in the moment. Right. And so I always ask anyone that says that they're an ally, I'm like, what are you willing to sacrifice for me?
wow, what are you willing to sacrifice for me? Are you going to just be kind of a behind the scenes supporter, or are you actually going to take the chance that you too will be in that scary place?
Yeah.
And what might a man what would that mean for a man to actually take action in that moment? What might they be sacrificing?
Right. It could be something as simple as just being part of the boys club, right? There's position and power. We talked about, Davos and what that really is. Um, your invitation to that may be
Mhm,
sacrificed.
mhm, mhm. Right.
And is that okay? Are you willing to give that up for the greater good? It could be anything from, oh, this person is, leading this charge over here. I don't know. But 9 times out of 10, if a man steps up to help or support, and we can talk about what that even looks like, because I don't want it to fall into saviorism either, um, they will be applauded for that,
Mm.
right? Very rarely, unless it's a super toxic environment, where they will be disowned by the boys club, is there any harm that's truly done, right?
Interesting. So there's
And
a
so
perception around loss of access when in fact it probably will likely increase their credibility as opposed to decreasing it.
exactly.
So, and one final piece that I would love, wellness privilege, I would love to touch on before we start to wrap up is I can afford to join out of office lunches or after work social activities. And I would love your take on that around the assumptions on that prompt as well.
Yeah, so when I first read that prompt, the question that came up is, well, why does it have to be something I can't afford, right? Is it a situation that I'm not comfortable being in, right? And I gave the example of working in a team where it was all women on this team. Um, we did some reorg, and so I was placed into this team. So there was a group that was already set, and how our cubes were set up, they were kind of bays of 6. So the 6 that were already there were kind of set in. So I ended up on an outside cube. Additionally, this group, they were friends. They all lived in like the same area, community. They all had children under 2. And so they had a lot in common. So when they would go out to lunch, they would just go as friends, and I was just never invited. And this happened for months and months and months. And so when my review came up, my boss says to me, who happened to be a man, said to me, well, you're antisocial. I
Wow.
don't see that you're, participating. You're not going to lunch with them. And I was just like, well, have you asked them if they've even invited me or offered? And he hadn't even thought about that, because what he was seeing was very different. And he also assumed that, well, you can put your lunch on your company card, and, all of these things. I'm like, it's not about me, not being able to pay for it. It's just, I'm not willing to put myself in an uncomfortable situation where I'm just there because you all want to feel good about yourselves.
Right. So it was the emotional cost, not the financial costs, that you
Exactly.
were unwilling. And so interesting that it was perceived as something that you were doing wrong when in fact this was, there was a larger dynamic at play that had not been revealed, would be
Exactly.
revealed. So what are the top 3 actions? I'm thinking about both outside in actions
Mhm.
that we need to be taking as well as inside out actions that we can take. So your top 3 takeaways for our listeners.
So the first one, ask who's not in the room.
Mm,
Like when you're making decisions, when you're deciding on, the next step or whatever it is, whose voice is not being heard, and be an advocate for that voice. Sometimes you may not even know what to say or do. Connect with that organization, connect with that group to make sure that you can advocate for them. Right. So often we go into these situations where decisions are being made and we only make those decisions based on us.
mm,
And what's important to us. And so those that are on the margins are constantly left out. So make sure that you can you ask who's not in the room. The second one is follow someone on social media that is not like you, right? That will give you a different perspective, that will challenge you in some of your thoughts. Someone that you can really step back and say, okay, I never thought about it that way. I can appreciate that perspective, right? And so that's going to constantly push you to learn and grow. And then the third thing is just take care of self. Do whatever you need to do to take care of yourself. I tell my clients that they should build in at least 5 to 10 minutes a day of vacation. And
Mm.
so what does that mean? It's, I need to go for a walk? The things that you did on vacation that you love. My family's from Barbados, and so I always love, fresh fruit or listening to the ocean or whatever it is. I have candles, I have sounds, I have all the things around me. So in those times where I feel like I need it, it's right here at my hands. And I don't have to go search for it. So do the things that you need to do to take care of yourself.
So ask who's not in the room, follow someone who's very different from yourself, who has very different experiences, different perspectives, and then take care of yourself. So that connection between standing up for DEI equality and at the same time caring for yourself.
Yes.
So Sacha, how can people stay in touch with you? And I know Jay will be writing this in the chat as well.
Thank you. So definitely on LinkedIn. Sacha Thompson is how it comes up on LinkedIn. So you can find me there. You can find me DEI After 5. So we are on YouTube and now your favorite podcast. We just expanded to podcast. And on social media, you can find me on Facebook or Instagram at the Equity Equation. How to think about that one? At the Equity Equation, or my website, theequityequation.com.
And I actually, full circle here, I found you, Sacha, on social media, your comment around allyship, that instead of a comment around being a mentor, that you spoke about, well, what about taking it one step further and thinking about being a sponsor? So thank you so much, Sacha Thompson, wonderful expert on equity, how we can create equality and inclusion for everyone and not just a few, tackling issues like wellness privilege and looking at issues around women and particularly women of color. Thank you to all of our listeners for being part of the conversation today. And we look forward to continuing the conversation. Sacha, thank you again.
Thank you, Laura, for having me.
Thanks, everyone.